January 8, 1811. Midnight. A plantation 40 miles upriver from New Orleans. About 25 enslaved men silently leave their quarters. They're armed with axes, cane knives, and a few stolen muskets. They march to the main house where their owner, Manuel Andre, is sleeping. They burst through the door, attack Andre with an axe, kill his son, steal weapons from the basement, put on military uniforms. Then they start marching, drums beating, flags waving. Freedom or death, they chant. As they move from plantation to plantation, more join them. 50, then 100, then 200. By the next morning, somewhere between 300 and 500 enslaved people are marching in military formation down the Mississippi River Road toward New Orleans. This was the largest slave rebellion in United States history. Bigger than Nat Turner. Bigger than John Brown's raid. Bigger than any slave uprising ever recorded on American soil. You've probably never heard of it, because they buried it, intentionally, systematically, for nearly 200 years. This is the story of Charles Dessalines and the German Coast Uprising, the rebellion that almost captured New Orleans, and the brutal suppression that authorities tried to erase from history. Subscribe right now if you're tired of sanitized history. Hit that bell. Drop a comment telling me where you're from. Let's see how many people are ready to hear the stories they don't teach in school. Because what happened in Louisiana in January 1811 was so terrifying to slave owners, so successful, so organized, so close to actually winning, that authorities spent the next century making sure Americans forgot it ever happened. They downplayed the numbers. They called it a disturbance. They executed the leaders and mounted their severed heads on poles as warnings. And they made sure that while everyone remembers Nat Turner's rebellion 20 years later, almost nobody knows about Charles Dessalines. But the story survived, passed down through generations of descendants, whispered in slave quarters, remembered by the families who fought for freedom. And now we're bringing it back. Let's talk about the army that almost changed American history. To understand why this happened, you need to understand where it happened. The German coast was a stretch of land along the Mississippi River about 25 to 40 miles northwest of New Orleans. It got its name from German immigrants who'd settled there in the 1720s. By 1811, it was sugar plantation country, some of the most fertile land in North America, and some of the most brutal working conditions for enslaved people anywhere in the South. Sugar isn't like cotton or tobacco. The harvest season is short, just a few months. During those months, enslaved people worked 18 to 20-hour days in crushing labor, cutting cane, processing it immediately before it spoiled, operating dangerous machinery that could sever limbs. The mortality rate was horrific. Plantation owners knew they were literally working people to death. Their business model factored in replacement costs. Between 1790 and 1810, slave traders brought approximately 20,000 enslaved Africans directly to New Orleans, not through other American ports, straight from West Africa to Louisiana. The population was a mix. People born into slavery in Louisiana, recent arrivals from West Africa, refugees from Haiti who'd participated in or witnessed the Haitian Revolution. That last group was crucial, because in 1804, enslaved people in Haiti had done the impossible. They'd overthrown French colonial rule, abolished slavery, and declared independence. The Haitian Revolution was the only successful slave revolt that resulted in an independent nation. And many of its veterans had fled to New Orleans when French planters evacuated Haiti. These Haitian refugees brought stories, strategies, proof that revolution was possible. Louisiana authorities were terrified. They knew they were sitting on a powder keg. The enslaved population outnumbered whites in many parishes. The swamps and bayous around New Orleans provided perfect hiding spots for runaways. Maroon colonies, communities of escaped slaves, existed within miles of the city. The territory of Orleans was new U.S. territory, acquired in the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. It wasn't even a state yet. Federal control was weak. Local militias were small. Perfect conditions for rebellion. Enter Charles Dessalines. Charles Dessalines was about 31 years old in 1811. mixed race, African and European descent. Some accounts say he was born in Haiti. Others say Saint-Domingue before the revolution. What we know for certain, he was a slave driver. That's important to understand. A slave driver wasn't a field hand. He was an enslaved overseer, someone who supervised other enslaved people, enforced discipline, reported to the white owner. It was a position of relative privilege. Better food, less physical labor, more trust from whites. Dessalines worked for Manuel André, one of the largest plantation owners on the German coast. André owned over 80 enslaved people. He was respected, wealthy, connected, and Charles Dessalines was planning to kill him. But Dessalines wasn't working alone. The rebellion had multiple leaders organizing across plantations. Cook and Quamana, two men who'd been captured in West Africa and brought to Louisiana in 1806. They were recent arrivals who remembered freedom, who hadn't been born into slavery and raised to accept it, who brought West African military traditions and warrior oaths. Harry Kenner, an enslaved carpenter from Virginia who worked on the Kenner and Henderson plantation near New Orleans. He recruited English-speaking enslaved people from the southern end of the German coast, built a network, gathered intelligence. These men spent months planning, meeting secretly, recruiting, using the mobility that enslaved people had, carrying messages between plantations, making deliveries, being rented out to neighbors, to build a network. They used a West African war oath to bind recruits. Anyone who joined swore they'd fight to the death. No backing out. No surrender. They studied the Haitian Revolution, learned its strategies, understood that you needed military discipline, not just rage. The plan was simple but audacious. Start at the André plantation. Seize weapons. March toward New Orleans, recruiting more enslaved people from every plantation they passed. Take the city. Free everyone. If they succeeded, they'd control the entire lower Mississippi River. They'd cut off one of America's most important ports. And they'd prove that enslaved people could overthrow their oppressors just like Haiti had done. January 8, 1811. The night chosen for rebellion. Around midnight, approximately 25 enslaved people gathered at the André plantation in St. John the Baptist Parish. Charles Dessalines led them to Manuel André's mansion. They burst through the door. Dessalines struck André with an axe, badly wounding him. The blow split his head open, but somehow André survived. His son, Gilbert André, wasn't as lucky. The rebels killed him. André, despite his severe wounds, managed to escape through a window and flee across the Mississippi River to the West Bank. He raised the alarm immediately, but the rebels didn't chase him. They had bigger plans. They ransacked the plantation basement, found muskets, ammunition, and, critically, military uniforms from André's militia. Dessalines knew the power of uniforms. The Haitian revolutionaries had warned them. Uniforms gave legitimacy, made you look like an army, not a mob. The rebels put on the uniforms, organized into military formation, and started marching south on River Road toward New Orleans. They beat drums, carried flags, marched in disciplined ranks. At every plantation they passed, they recruited more. About 10 to 25% of each plantation's enslaved population joined them. This wasn't random chaos. This was organized. Witnesses, white planters who saw them march past, remarked on their military discipline. They weren't running wild. They were marching like soldiers. At the next plantation, a man named Cook, one of the key leaders, attacked and killed François Trepignier with an axe. He was the second and last white person killed during the entire rebellion. Think about that. Between 300 to 500 armed, angry people who'd been enslaved, beaten, worked to death, and they only killed 2 white men. This wasn't about revenge killing. This was strategic. They needed to move fast, recruit more, reach New Orleans. By the morning of January 9th, the rebel army was somewhere between 200 to 500 strong. Sources vary because authorities later tried to downplay the numbers. They were armed mostly with farm tools, cane knives, axes, hoes. Some had muskets. They carried makeshift weapons. But they had numbers and momentum, and they were 25 miles from New Orleans. White residents on surrounding plantations saw them coming and fled toward the city in panic. Letters describe terrified planters abandoning their homes, taking whatever valuables they could carry. Word reached New Orleans. Governor William C.C. Claiborne, the territorial governor, immediately ordered a lockdown and curfew. He called up every available militia member. And he did something unprecedented. He requested federal troops. This was the first time in United States history that federal military forces were deployed to suppress a slave rebellion. General Wade Hampton, yes, that Hampton family, took command. He assembled a force of U.S. Army troops, local militia, and armed volunteers. Meanwhile, Major Homer Virgil Milton was ordered to move troops downriver from Baton Rouge, approaching from the north. And Manuel Andre, despite his severe head wound, rallied militia on the west bank of the Mississippi. 3 armed forces, all converging on the rebels. January 10th. Morning. The rebels had reached Bernard Bernoudy's plantation in St. Charles Parish. They were about 18 miles from New Orleans. Hampton's forces made first contact. A unit of his troops encountered the rebels and opened fire. The rebels fought back, but they were outgunned. Muskets and military discipline versus farm tools and courage. Then Andre's militia hit them from behind. The rebels were caught between 2 forces. Hampton's troops from the south. Andre's militia from across the river. What happened next was a massacre. Accounts vary, but at least 40 to 60 rebels were killed in the battle itself. Shot down as they tried to maintain formation. Cut down as they retreated into the swamps. Some tried to surrender. They were killed anyway. Some tried to run. Hunted down in the following days. The entire battle lasted maybe a few hours. By afternoon, the rebellion was effectively crushed. But the killing wasn't over. Not even close. Authorities captured dozens of rebels who'd survived the battle. Over the next week, they conducted 3 separate trials. One at Destrehan Plantation in St. John the Baptist Parish. One in St. Charles Parish. One in Orleans Parish. These weren't real trials. There were no defenses, no due process, just quick tribunals where enslaved people were condemned in minutes. On January 13th, the Destrehan Plantation trial sentenced 18 men to death. They were executed by firing squad. But death wasn't enough. Authorities decapitated the executed rebels. They mounted their severed heads on poles along River Road, the main route to New Orleans. For miles, travelers could see the heads of the rebellion leaders decomposing on stakes. A warning. A message. This is what happens when you resist. Charles Deslands was captured on January 15th. His execution was particularly brutal. They shot him. Then, while he was still alive, they chopped off his hands. Then his thighs. Then they burned his body. All in public. All designed to terrorize anyone who might think about resisting. In total, approximately 95 rebels were killed, either in battle or executed afterward, plus the 40 to 60 killed during the fighting itself. That makes the German Coast Uprising the bloodiest suppression of a slave rebellion in American history. More deaths than Nat Turner's rebellion. More than the Stono Rebellion. More than any other. And then, they tried to make everyone forget it happened. Here's where it gets really disturbing. Governor Claiborne knew he had a problem. The German Coast Uprising had been huge. Hundreds of armed slaves nearly reaching New Orleans. Federal troops required to stop them. Brutal public executions. This was terrible optics for Louisiana, which wasn't even a state yet. Just a territory trying to prove it could govern itself. Trying to attract settlers and investment. A massive slave rebellion made Louisiana look dangerous and unstable. So Claiborne did something calculated. He controlled the narrative. In official reports to Washington, he downplayed everything. Called it a disturbance. Minimized the numbers. Emphasized that only 2 white people died. As if that proved the rebellion wasn't serious. In a speech 3 weeks after the uprising, Claiborne focused on the heroic roles white men played in protecting and defending the city. He made it about white courage, not black resistance. Federal authorities were happy to go along with this. They paid plantation owners for their lost property, the enslaved people who died. That made the owners happy. Nobody wanted to talk about it anymore. Newspapers across the country barely covered it. The ones that did used language like brigands and bandits, not revolutionaries or rebels. Compare that to how they covered Nat Turner's rebellion 20 years later in Virginia. Turner's uprising killed about 60 white people over 2 days. It got massive national coverage for months. Turner became a household name. Charles Dessalines led a rebellion with 500 people over 3 days. He came within miles of capturing New Orleans. But nobody knows his name. Why the difference? Geography matters. Virginia was established core American territory. What happened there mattered to northern newspapers and politicians. Louisiana in 1811 was frontier territory, just 8 years after the Louisiana Purchase. Still seen as wild, lawless, foreign. Violence there could be dismissed as expected in untamed regions. Timing matters. Turner's rebellion happened in 1831, when abolitionist movements were gaining strength in the North. It became political ammunition. The German Coast Uprising happened in 1811, before major abolitionist organizing. There was no political benefit to publicizing it. The threat was too real. Turner's rebellion was scary but failed quickly. The German Coast Uprising nearly succeeded. It almost took a major American city. Authorities didn't want to give anyone ideas. Didn't want enslaved people in other states hearing about an army of 500 that almost won. So they buried it. And it worked. By the 1900s, most historians didn't even know it happened. When they did mention it, they called it Andre's Rebellion, named after the white plantation owner who got attacked, not the black leaders who organized it. The erasure was so complete that as late as 1995, there was no public memorial. No historical marker. Nothing. But the story survived. In the only place it could, oral history, descendants of the rebels passed it down. Grandparents telling grandchildren. Families remembering ancestors who fought and died. In 1923, a researcher noted that older black men still relate the story of the slave insurrection of 1811 as they heard it from their grandfathers. The names survived: Charles Dessalines, Cook, Quamana, Harry Kenner. Heroes in their communities even when history books ignored them. In 1995, the African American History Alliance of Louisiana started an annual commemoration. Every January, they gather at Norco, where the rebellion began, to honor the rebels. In 2014, the Whitney Plantation opened in St. John the Baptist Parish. It's the first plantation museum in the country dedicated entirely to the enslaved experience. The Whitney includes a memorial for the 1811 uprising. 63 ceramic heads on steel rods along a pond, representing the decapitated rebels whose heads were mounted on poles. In 2019, artist Dred Scott organized a massive reenactment. Over 2 days, participants marched the 26-mile route from the Andre Plantation to New Orleans, wearing period clothing, carrying flags, recreating the march. Hundreds participated. Thousands watched. And finally, 208 years later, the German Coast Uprising got the recognition it deserved. Historians now call it what it was: the largest slave rebellion in United States history. Daniel Rasmussen wrote American Uprising, the untold story of America's largest slave revolt in 2011. It brought academic attention back to the event. But here's what bothers me: we teach kids about Nat Turner. We teach them about John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. Both important, both worthy of remembering. But Charles Dessalines led an army 5 times larger. He came closer to success. He showed sophisticated military organization. He nearly captured a major American city. Why isn't his name as famous as Nat Turner's? Because authorities in 1811 didn't want him to be. Because they knew that making him famous would make him a martyr, would inspire more rebellions. So they erased him, cut off his hands and burned his body and made sure nobody remembered his name. But they failed. The story lived in the memories of descendants, in the oral histories of Louisiana's black communities, in the whispered tales of resistance passed down through generations. And now we're bringing it back. 500 enslaved people, 26 miles, 3 days. They marched in military formation toward freedom. They were so close. 18 miles from New Orleans when the federal troops caught them. If they'd moved faster, if they'd had more guns, if federal troops hadn't arrived so quickly, they might have taken the city, freed thousands more, changed American history, but they didn't, and 95 of them died for trying. Their bodies mutilated, their heads mounted on poles. And then, for 200 years, America tried to forget they existed. The German Coast Uprising should be as famous as the American Revolution. It was a revolution, a fight for freedom against tyranny, military organization, strategic planning, courage in the face of impossible odds. But it was a revolution by enslaved people, and that made it dangerous to remember. So they called it a disturbance. They minimized the numbers. They named it after the white plantation owner who got hurt instead of the black leaders who organized it. They succeeded for a long time, but not anymore. Charles Dessalines, Cook, Quamana, Harry Kenner, the 500 who marched, the 95 who died. Their names are coming back. Their story is being told. And no amount of historical amnesia can erase them anymore. So here's my question. Why do you think they erased this rebellion from history? Was it fear that others would be inspired? Shame that it almost succeeded? Or something else? Drop your thoughts in the comments. And if this story opened your eyes to history they don't teach in schools, subscribe, hit that bell, and share this with someone who needs to know about the army that almost freed Louisiana. Until next time, remember that the stories they tried to bury are often the most important ones to tell.